Gotham City had always danced with darkness, but tonight the shadows themselves seemed to tremble with fear. The skyline, normally shrouded in familiar fog and the comfortable gloom of a city that had learned to embrace its own corruption, now burned with an unfamiliar chaos that made even the oldest buildings groan in protest. Streets that had witnessed decades of crime and heroism cracked under explosions that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Windows shattered in cascading waves across entire blocks, and the very foundations of skyscrapers shuddered as a force unlike anything this wounded city had ever experienced swept through its heart with terrible, deliberate purpose. For weeks, whispers had crawled through the underground networks that Batman monitored with obsessive precision. Rumors spoke of something rising in the forgotten places beneath the city, something that fed on fear itself and grew stronger with each passing night. The usual informants had gone silent one by one, their last messages fragmented and desperate. Even the Joker had retreated to Arkham voluntarily, a development so unprecedented that Batman had initially suspected an elaborate trap. But the Clown Prince of Crime had simply laughed when questioned, his eyes showing something Batman had never seen in them before: genuine terror. Now, standing atop Wayne Tower with his cape snapping violently in winds that carried the acrid smell of burning metal and something else, something ancient and wrong, Batman understood why. His eyes, hidden behind the white lenses of his cowl, scanned the horizon with mechanical precision while his mind processed dozens of data streams simultaneously. Thermal imaging revealed heat signatures that defied physics. Spectral analysis detected energy patterns that matched nothing in his extensive database. The very air seemed charged with a malevolent intelligence that made his skin crawl beneath the armored suit. He had faced the worst that humanity could offer: the calculating brilliance of Ra's al Ghul, the chemical madness of Scarecrow, the brutal strength of Bane, the cosmic threats of Darkseid and his Parademon armies. Each enemy had tested him in different ways, forcing him to evolve, to become something more than human while never losing his humanity. But this presence that now descended upon his city carried a weight that pressed against his consciousness like cold fingers probing for weakness. This was not merely physical power or intellectual challenge. This was something that existed in the spaces between reality, something that had been waiting for this moment across millennia. Below him, the streets had become rivers of panic. Citizens who had grown accustomed to the peculiar dangers of Gotham now fled in directions that made no logical sense, their survival instincts overwhelmed by a terror that bypassed rational thought entirely. Police sirens wailed in futile chorus, their familiar sound somehow distorted and wrong, as if the very frequencies were being twisted by unseen forces. Commissioner Gordon's voice crackled through Batman's communicator, fragments of words fighting through interference that seemed almost deliberate in its malice. Batman's gloved fingers moved across the holographic interface projected from his gauntlet, pulling up every contingency plan he had ever developed. Plan Omega, Protocol Lazarus, the Justice League emergency beacon that could summon the most powerful beings on Earth within minutes. Each option flickered through his tactical mind, weighed against the unknown variables of this new threat, and found wanting. The League was scattered across the galaxy, responding to a coordinated series of attacks that he now realized had been designed specifically to leave Earth vulnerable. Diana was in Themyscira, dealing with an ancient curse that had suddenly awakened. Clark was light years away, trapped in a sector where red sun radiation had been weaponized across entire solar systems. Arthur was defending Atlantis from creatures that had emerged from trenches even his people had never explored. He was alone, and for the first time in his long career as Gotham's Guardian, Bruce Wayne felt the cold touch of genuine doubt. The explosion came without warning, a pillar of green-black energy that erupted from the center of the financial district with enough force to flatten 3 city blocks instantly. Batman watched, his body unconsciously tensing against the shockwave that would arrive in precisely 2.7 seconds, as buildings that had stood for a century simply ceased to exist. In their place rose something that defied architectural logic, a structure that seemed to grow rather than be built, its surfaces shifting between solid matter and something that hurt to look at directly. From within this impossible edifice emerged the source of Gotham's terror. The figure stood 12 feet tall, wrapped in armor that seemed forged from crystallized nightmares. Its face, if it could be called a face, was a void of absolute darkness, framed by a crown of twisted metal that pulsed with the same sickly green-black energy. When it spoke, the words came from everywhere at once, from the cracks in the pavement, from the flames consuming nearby buildings, from the terrified screams of dying civilians. The message was simple and absolute. This world belonged to it now. Resistance was not merely futile, it was irrelevant. The strong would serve, the weak would feed its eternal hunger, and the one they called Batman, the creature that wore fear as a weapon, would learn what true fear meant before the end. Batman's response was immediate and precisely calculated. 3 batarangs, each containing enough explosive compound to level a small building, arced through the air with perfect accuracy toward the entity's apparent weak points. Simultaneously, he triggered the EMP devices he had planted across the district during his earlier reconnaissance, hoping to disrupt whatever energy field the creature was generating. His grappling hook fired, pulling him toward a better vantage point, even as his other hand released a cloud of specialized gas designed to obscure thermal and visual detection. Every attack failed. The batarangs passed through the entity as if it were made of smoke, their explosions detonating harmlessly in the rubble beyond. The EMP pulse seemed to be absorbed, actually strengthening the green-black glow rather than disrupting it. And the creature turned its void face toward Batman's new position with casual precision, tracking him through every countermeasure, as if he were a child playing hide and seek. The blast came faster than human reflexes could process. Batman's armor absorbed the initial impact, its energy dispersal systems screaming warnings as they exceeded every design parameter. He felt ribs crack despite the protection, felt the sickening sensation of being hurled through space without any control over his trajectory. The wall of a parking garage stopped his flight with brutal finality, and for several seconds, the world became a constellation of pain and fragmented consciousness. When clarity returned, Batman found himself on his knees in a crater of broken concrete, his armor systems flickering with damage warnings. Blood filled his mouth, the copper taste familiar and somehow grounding. His left arm hung at an angle that suggested dislocation at minimum, and the entity was approaching, each step causing the ground to crack and reform in its wake, reality itself bending to accommodate its presence. In that moment, with death approaching in a form that even his legendary will could not overcome, Bruce Wayne made a decision that went against every principle he had built his crusade upon. His right hand, trembling slightly from pain and exhaustion, activated a frequency he had hoped never to use, a signal that would travel beyond the boundaries of his city, his country, his understanding of how the universe operated. A call for help that admitted, finally and completely, that some threats required power beyond what any single man, no matter how driven or prepared, could provide. The signal pulsed outward, carrying encoded data about the threat, the city's situation, and a simple request that Batman had never made before. Help, please. Across the continent, in a hidden laboratory where gamma radiation had permanently altered the course of one man's existence, instruments began to scream with alerts. Bruce Banner, the brilliant scientist cursed and blessed with the most powerful alter ego in existence, looked up from his research with sudden intensity. His heart rate, normally monitored with obsessive precision to prevent unwanted transformations, began to climb as he processed the incoming data. Gotham, a threat classification he had never seen before, and a distress signal from someone he knew only by reputation, a man who supposedly never asked anyone for anything. The transformation was not instantaneous, but it was inevitable. Banner felt the familiar pressure building behind his eyes, the sensation of his consciousness being pushed aside as something vast and ancient and impossibly powerful rose to take control. His skin rippled, stretching and changing color as his body mass increased by orders of magnitude. Clothes tore, laboratory equipment shattered, and the building itself groaned as the Hulk emerged fully, his roar shaking windows for miles in every direction. Unlike the mindless rage that had characterized his earliest transformations, this Hulk carried purpose. Something in the signal had triggered not just the creature's power, but also a flicker of Banner's intelligence, enough to understand direction and necessity. Gotham needed smashing. Something bad was hurting people who couldn't protect themselves. And somewhere in the chaos, someone was fighting alone when they shouldn't have to. The Hulk moved. To observers along his path, it would have seemed like a natural disaster given conscious direction. Forests were trampled, highways cleared of obstacles, rivers crossed in single bounds that covered miles. The Hulk's trajectory was not precise, guided more by instinct and the fading echo of the distress signal than by any sophisticated navigation. But it was relentless. Nothing slowed his approach. Nothing could. Back in Gotham, time had become meaningless for the city's defender. Batman had retreated, regrouped, attacked again with different strategies, and been defeated each time. His armor was barely functional, held together by emergency repairs and pure determination. 3 more ribs had joined the first in their broken chorus of agony. His cowl's display flickered, showing him tactical data that offered no viable solutions. The entity had stopped actively pursuing him, apparently content to continue its transformation of the city center while he exhausted himself against inevitable defeat. Citizens were dying. He could hear their screams, could calculate the casualty rate climbing with each passing minute, could do absolutely nothing to stop it. This was his nightmare made manifest, the one fear that even he had never fully conquered, the moment when preparation, training, and will simply were not enough. When being the best humanity had to offer still meant being human, with all the limitations that implied. The ground began to shake with a rhythm that was somehow different from the entity's reality-warping pulses. More primal, more physical, approaching fast from the east. Batman turned, his body protesting the movement, and witnessed something that would remain seared in his memory for the rest of his days. The Hulk arrived in Gotham not with the subtlety of a hero making an entrance, but with the force of a continent deciding to relocate. His landing crater swallowed an entire intersection, sending shockwaves that shattered windows for blocks and knocked the already panicking civilians off their feet. He rose from the impact point like a mountain deciding to stand up, his green skin gleaming with a faint luminescence of residual gamma energy, his eyes scanning the cityscape with an intelligence that seemed to flicker between animal cunning and something more. The citizens of Gotham, who had seen everything from killer clowns to cosmic invaders, collectively held their breath. This was different. This was raw power on a scale that made their familiar horrors seem almost quaint in comparison. Some fled faster. Some stood frozen, unable to process what their eyes were reporting. A few, the ones who had survived enough Gotham nights to develop a peculiar form of optimism, felt something they hadn't experienced since the chaos began: hope. The Hulk's gaze found the entity in the distance, and his roar shook the remaining glass from nearby buildings. Whatever intelligence guided him recognized a worthy target, an enemy that deserved the full measure of his impossible strength. He began to move toward the creature, each step cracking pavement and leaving footprints deep enough to serve as emergency shelters. Batman watched this arrival with the analytical mind that never fully stopped working, even through pain and exhaustion. The Hulk represented power that could potentially match the entity's supernatural might, but power without direction was often more dangerous than helpful. He had studied Banner's other self extensively, prepared contingency plans for potential confrontations, analyzed every recorded instance of Hulk's rampages for weaknesses and patterns. What he saw now didn't match his files. There was purpose here, something driving the Green Giant beyond simple rage. The decision crystallized in Batman's tactical mind with the clarity that only true desperation could provide. He couldn't defeat this enemy alone. The Hulk alone would likely cause as much damage as he prevented. But together, with Batman's strategy guiding Hulk's strength, they might have a chance. It went against every instinct of a man who had built his legend on solitary competence. But Bruce Wayne had not survived this long by letting pride override necessity. His grappling hook fired, carrying him on an intercept course with the approaching giant. Every movement was agony, every breath a reminder of his broken body, but he pushed through it with the discipline of decades. He landed on a rooftop directly in the Hulk's path, planting himself visibly in the creature's line of sight. The Hulk stopped, his massive head tilted slightly, and those impossibly deep eyes focused on the small, battered figure in black standing before him. For a moment, the air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether this encounter would add another disaster to an already catastrophic night. Batman spoke, his voice carrying despite its roughness from injury and exertion. He didn't explain or plead. He simply stated facts. There was a monster destroying his city. It was too powerful for him to stop alone. But together, with the Hulk's strength and his guidance, they could end this. If the Hulk could understand, if some part of Banner's brilliant mind was still in there, then he needed to listen and trust. The Hulk's response was not verbal. Instead, he crouched slightly, bringing his massive face closer to Batman's level, and waited. It was the most eloquent agreement the creature could offer, a willingness to follow, at least for now, someone who seemed to know what they were doing. Batman nodded once and turned toward the entity's location. The briefing was immediate and essential. Hit hard, but hit where he indicated. Protect civilians when possible. And if things went wrong, get him close enough to implement a backup plan that he was already formulating even as they moved. The Hulk grunted acknowledgement and followed. The battle that followed would become legend, whispered about in Gotham's underground for generations. The entity, confident in its superiority after dismantling Batman's earlier attacks, did not initially recognize the threat approaching. When the Hulk's first punch connected, delivering force measured in megatons to what had seemed like an invincible target, reality itself seemed to hiccup in surprise. The creature staggered. It was not defeat, not even close, but it was possibility. Batman's mind seized on this information, calculating angles and timing with desperate precision. He directed the Hulk's attacks, shouting instructions that somehow penetrated the giant's rage, guiding those devastating blows toward points where the entity's armor seemed slightly different, slightly vulnerable. The creature adapted quickly, its form becoming more fluid, harder to target, and its counterattacks became more vicious. Energy blasts that could have vaporized normal matter splashed against the Hulk's gamma-irradiated hide and merely drove him back, triggering greater rage and therefore greater strength. Batman used these moments to analyze, to probe, to seek the weakness that every enemy possessed. The battle moved through the city like a hurricane with consciousness. Entire blocks became collateral damage, though Batman's guidance minimized civilian casualties by drawing the fight away from populated areas when possible and using the Hulk's body as a shield for evacuation routes. The entity's power was immense, seemingly limitless, but the Hulk's anger was infinite, and Batman's mind never stopped calculating. Hours passed. The night began to fade toward dawn. Both combatants showed signs of the prolonged conflict. The Hulk's green skin was marked with wounds that would have killed any conventional being 1,000 times over, wounds that healed almost as quickly as they were inflicted. The entity's void face showed something that might have been frustration, might have been the alien equivalent of exhaustion. And Batman, pushed beyond every limit he had ever known, continued to coordinate the assault with a voice that had become a ragged whisper. The weakness revealed itself in the entity's crown. Batman had suspected it from the beginning, had noticed how the creature's defensive efforts seemed to prioritize that twisted metal construction above all else. Now, as the prolonged battle wore away the being's regenerative capacity, he confirmed it. The crown was the anchor, the point where this extra-dimensional horror connected to physical reality. Destroy it, and the entity would be cast back to whatever nightmare realm had spawned it. Getting the Hulk to understand precision targeting was the challenge. Batman's communication had been largely simple. Hit this, block that, move here. But this required something more nuanced. He needed the Hulk to focus all that impossible strength on a single specific point, to deliver not a wild blow, but a focused strike of incredible precision. Somehow, in the pre-dawn light of a burning city, understanding passed between them. Perhaps some portion of Banner's consciousness recognized the tactical necessity. Perhaps the Hulk's own strange intelligence grasped what was needed. Or perhaps their hours of coordinated combat had built a rapport that transcended conventional communication. The Hulk waited for the opening that Batman created. Using the last of his functional gadgets, Batman generated a distraction that drew the entity's attention for just a moment. The creature turned toward this new threat, its guard shifting, its crown exposed. The Hulk struck. The impact was beyond measurement. Air itself seemed to flee the point of contact. The entity's crown shattered into fragments that dissolved before they hit the ground, and the creature's void face split with a sound that was less a scream and more a reality trying to reject a foreign element. Green-black energy erupted outward, a death throes of something that had never truly been alive in any conventional sense. When the light faded and silence returned to the ruined streets of Gotham, the entity was gone. Not defeated in any permanent sense, perhaps, but banished, cast back to its dimension of origin with its anchor destroyed and its plans shattered. The Hulk stood in the center of the devastation, chest heaving with exertions that would have killed any other being. His eyes scanned the ruins, seeking more enemies, finding none. Slowly, his posture shifted from combat readiness to something resembling confusion. The target was gone. The smashing was done. What was he supposed to do now? Batman approached on legs that threatened to give way with each step. His armor was ruined, his body broken in more ways than he would admit, but he walked toward the most powerful creature on Earth with the same confidence he had shown facing criminals in dark alleys years ago. When he reached the Hulk's position, he did something that surprised them both. He extended his hand, not in surrender or supplication, but in acknowledgement. Thanks. Respect. The recognition that they had accomplished together what neither could have achieved alone. The Hulk stared at this small gesture with an expression that cycled through several emotions before settling on something that might have been understanding. His massive hand moved slowly, carefully, touching Batman's gauntlet with a gentleness that seemed impossible for something of his strength. A grunt emerged, carrying meaning that transcended language. You fight good. We smashed bad thing. Maybe do again sometime. Batman allowed himself a small nod, the closest thing to a smile his battered face could manage. His city was in ruins, but his city would rebuild. The threat had been vanquished, and in the process, something unexpected had been forged. Not friendship exactly. That word was too simple for what had passed between them. More like mutual recognition of what they each represented, and what they could achieve when those representations aligned. Dawn broke over Gotham City, painting the smoke and rubble in shades of gold and orange. Citizens emerged from their hiding places, blinking in the light, surveying the devastation with a peculiar resilience that came from living in this city. They had survived again. Many had been lost, and many more had been changed forever, but survival was its own victory. The legend spread quickly. Stories of the Green Giant who had answered Gotham's need, fighting alongside their Dark Guardian against something beyond imagination. Some versions would grow in the telling, adding details that had never happened, making the battle even more spectacular than it had actually been. But the core truth would remain. When the darkness came too deep for one hero to face alone, help had arrived from the most unexpected of sources. In the weeks that followed, as Gotham began the long process of rebuilding, Batman and Hulk parted ways. Banner emerged from one of his transformations in a field outside the city, confused and exhausted, with fragmented memories of battles and a strange, grudging respect for a man dressed as a bat. He would later receive a secure communication containing analysis of his condition, potential stabilization theories, and a simple message. Gotham owes you a debt. If you ever need help, call. Batman, meanwhile, threw himself into the reconstruction with the same obsessive focus he applied to everything. But he also began preparing for the next threat, informed by new understanding of what coordination between power and strategy could achieve. The Justice League would eventually reassemble, and Diana and Clark would offer their help, but they would find their teammate changed, more willing to delegate, more aware of the value of unexpected allies. And somewhere in the depths of interdimensional space, the entity that had nearly conquered Gotham nursed its wounds and plotted revenge. It had underestimated this world, underestimated the resilience of beings it had considered primitives. That mistake would not be repeated. When it returned, and it would return, it would bring forces sufficient to overwhelm any combination of defenders these fragile creatures could assemble. The war was far from over, but for now, on this dawn after the longest night, victory belonged to those who had stood together against the dark. The city breathed, the people hoped, and the legend of the night when Brain and Brawn united to save the world began its journey into eternity. Script complete.